Welcome back for another deep dive with us. We make decisions all the time, big and small, but today we're really zooming in on the tough ones, those choices in life, and work with high stakes.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The ones that keep you up at night, right?
Exactly. And we often think we're being so rational and logical, weighing every factor, but it turns out our thinking can be a lot messier than we realize.
It really can. It's fascinating how our brains work.
And that's exactly what Rex Brown gets into in his book, Rational Choice and Judgment. He digs deep into this gap between how we think we decide versus how we actually do it. Honestly, reading this book made me realize I've probably made my fair share of, what does he call them? Subrational decisions.
Oh, yeah, subrational choices. I love that term. It's so spot on. Basically, decisions that, well, don't quite line up with our goals or values.
It's like, let me think. Like when you're scrolling online late at night and boom, you buy something you absolutely don't need. Is that subrational?
Totally. That's a classic example. We've all been there. It's that instant gratification, isn't it?
And Brown doesn't just point out these little everyday slip-ups. He goes big picture, too.
Yeah.
Real-world examples where these subrational decisions have serious consequences.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about cases where, for example, citizens were completely swayed by, political rhetoric or regulators making risky calls on public health because their reasoning was just flawed.
It really makes you stop and think, like, wow, even our seemingly personal choices can have a ripple effect way beyond ourselves.
Right. It's all connected. It's a web in a way.
One example that really got me was this anecdote he shares about a judge sentencing a murderer based solely on, get this, how entertaining the trial was.
Wait, really? That sounds wild.
I know, right? It's like, what? But it illustrates this point. Focusing on just one aspect of a decision, even something as bizarre as entertainment value, can lead to outcomes that totally clash with bigger goals, like justice.
It's like looking at a tiny piece of a huge puzzle and thinking you understand the whole picture, you know?
It's almost like we can trick ourselves into thinking we're being rational when really we're just fixated on one narrow thing.
Totally. And that's where things can go wrong. We forget the bigger picture, the values that should be guiding us.
So, okay, if we're all prone to these subrational slip-ups, what's the antidote? Brown talks about this idea of, what was it, decision aiding.
Yeah. Decision aiding.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not as complicated or futuristic as it sounds.
I was picturing robots making all our decisions for us.
Huh. Not quite. It's more about using tools and techniques to give our own judgment a boost.
Like a helping hand, or like, a trusty sidekick.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. A sidekick to help you navigate those tricky choices, making your thinking clearer, more transparent, less susceptible to those sneaky biases that creep in.
And Brown, he's really into the quantitative tools, right? Using numbers and data.
He is, but it's not about blindly following the numbers. It's about using them to sharpen our thinking.
It's like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, like using a magnifying glass to get a better look at a tricky problem.
I like that. It's about zooming in, breaking things down into smaller, more manageable pieces, especially when we're feeling overwhelmed or just unsure which way to go.
And he talks about this GEO framework, which, okay, sounds kind of basic at first, goals, options, outcomes. But he makes this argument that even the simplest choices can benefit from this kind of structured analysis.
Oh, absolutely. It forces you to really pinpoint what you want, the goals, the different paths you could take, the options, and what could happen down each path, the outcomes. It sounds obvious, but you'd be amazed how often people jump into decisions without really thinking through those pieces.
He has this funny example about someone saying, I don't like broccoli.
Right.
And he asks, is that really a preference, a goal?
Right.
Or is it about the options? Maybe they just haven't had broccoli cooked the right way.
That's so true. It's like, have you tried it roasted with some garlic and Parmesan?
It's such a simple example, but it highlights how easy it is to get those seemingly basic parts of a decision mixed up.
It's like before we even start weighing the pros and cons, we need to be super clear on what we're actually trying to achieve. What are the goals, the values driving this whole thing? Once we have that solid base, then we can explore our options in a much more effective way.
So we've got this great framework, this GEO thing, goals, options, outcomes. But how do we actually start, comparing those options and figuring out which one's the best fit for what we want? Especially when, let's be real, there's always some uncertainty involved. Life's not a spreadsheet, right?
That's where the numbers come in. That's where decision analysis gets, well, a little more analytical. Brown introduces some really cool tools for dealing with, on the one hand, our own preferences, what we want, and then on the other hand, all the uncertainty we have to deal with.
One of the big ones he talks about is utility, which I gotta admit sounds a bit technical. Can you break that down for us? Make it a little less, jargony?
Utility It's basically about putting a number on our preferences. It's like creating a scale so we can
Mhm.
compare things that seem totally different. You know,
Yeah.
like how do you compare the potential income of a career path to how much you'd enjoy the work itself?
Yeah, because those are apples and oranges, right?
Exactly. Utility helps us assign values to all these different aspects so we can see how they stack up against each other. It's like bringing a little more objectivity to those gut feelings we have.
So it's not about ignoring our emotions or anything, but rather figuring out a way to include them in the process, but in a more, I don't know, organized way.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And Brown talks about different ways to measure utility. Sometimes it's straightforward, like using money, but other times you might use rating scales,
Hmm.
you know, where you define what the best and worst possible outcomes would be for each thing you're considering.
I can see that being helpful for, like, let's say you're choosing a place to live. You might rate different neighborhoods on affordability, how close they are to work, access to parks, stuff like that. Each factor has its own scale, right? But then you can use utility to kind of create an overall score for each neighborhood.
Exactly. That's a
Yeah.
perfect example. And what Brown emphasizes is that even choosing the right scale, that's a judgment call too. It's about finding what works best for the specific decision you're grappling with. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
He also talks about certain equivalents, which honestly, when I first saw that, I was like, huh.
It sounds more complex than it is.
Yeah.
It's actually a really useful idea, especially when a decision involves risk.
Yeah.
Imagine you have a choice, right? A guaranteed $5 or a 50-50 chance of either winning $20 or losing 10.
Okay, I'm listening. So like a coin toss, basically.
Exactly. So the certain equivalent is the amount of money you take as a guaranteed payout instead of taking that gamble.
So someone who's like really afraid of losing money, their certain equivalent might be even less than $5 because they just want that sure thing.
Exactly. But then someone who loves taking risks, their certain equivalent might be way higher than $5 because they're excited about that potential for a big win.
So it's like, how much are you willing to bet on yourself or bet on the odds or however you think about it?
Yeah. It's a way to measure how comfortable we are with uncertainty. And Brown shows how this idea can be used for even bigger decisions. Remember that career choice example? He talks about how you can convert both economic and non-economic factors, like job satisfaction or work-life balance, into what he calls peak income equivalents.
So you're putting everything on the same scale, like using money as the common denominator.
Exactly. It makes those trade-offs, the ones we're often making without even realizing it, it makes them so much clearer. It's like revealing what our preferences are really telling us.
It's like translating everything into the same language, so to speak. But Brown is also really careful to remind us that, quantitative models, they're not magic. He tells the story about a Ford executive who almost discontinued, wait for it, convertibles. And it was all based on the financial
Oh, I
projections.
remember that example.
Yeah.
That was a close one.
Right, because he later realized, wait a minute, I didn't factor in the value of the anything else
All the
categories.
stuff that's hard to quantify.
Things like, how cool is it to drive a convertible? What does it say about the Ford brand? You can't just put those things in a spreadsheet, but they matter a lot.
They do. Sometimes those things are the tiebreaker.
Yeah.
So even when we're using these quantitative tools, it's super important to zoom out, look at the whole picture, and be honest that there are always things we can't perfectly capture in a model.
Totally. And speaking of things that are tough to pin down, what about just dealing with uncertainty in general? Most big decisions, you just don't know how things are going to play out. How does Brown deal with that?
He uses probability distributions. Don't worry, it's not as scary as it sounds.
When you say probability distributions, I immediately think of like complex graphs and equations and stuff.
Well, if he focuses on the practical side of things, instead of getting bogged down in the math, he suggests using point estimates, things like the mode, the median, the average, to get a sense of the most likely outcome.
So like what's probably going to happen, big picture, even if we can't know for sure.
Right. It's like getting a ballpark figure, knowing it's not going to be exact, but it gives you a starting point to think about the possibilities.
It's like all models are wrong, but some are useful. That's what they say, right?
Exactly. And he also talks about considering plausible ranges, not just a single point estimate. Like with the career example, you might come up with a number for potential peak income, but how much uncertainty is there around that number? What's the range of possibilities?
It's like, okay, this is the target, but I got to be prepared to land somewhere within, this whole area.
That's a great way to think about it. It's about accepting that we can't control everything. We make the best choices we can with the information we have, but we have to be comfortable with not knowing all the answers.
Okay, so we have all these tools, right, for figuring out our preferences, dealing with uncertainty, but how do we know which one to use and when? Brown mentions decision aiding strategy. What's that all about?
Decision aiding strategy, it's like choosing the right tool for the job. Sometimes a simple intuitive approach is better than some complex model. And it's about knowing what each tool can and can't do so you use them in the right way.
So it's not just about following a formula, but being smart about which approach is going to work best in each situation.
Exactly. And Brown tells this funny story about his own students, his decision analysis course. And they try to use all these fancy techniques, but they don't really get the core ideas behind them.
Oh no, what happened?
Let's just say it didn't go so well. They ended up with results that didn't make any sense because they were so focused on the mechanics of the model that they lost sight of the bigger picture.
It's like you can have the most amazing high-tech kitchen gadget in the world, but if you don't know how to use it, you're just going to make a mess.
It's a great analogy. We have to understand how these tools work, what they're good at, what their weaknesses are, to really use them well.
And Brown is really big on considering the decision maker's own goals and constraints. What works for one person might not work for someone else or for a whole organization. It's not one size fits all, is it?
It's about that balance between complexity and practicality. You want models that are sophisticated enough to be useful, but not so complicated that they're impossible to actually use. Otherwise, you're just making things harder for yourself.
One thing that I found really fascinating in the book was when he talked about the human factor. All the research on cognitive biases, those little mental quirks that can mess with our thinking, even when we think we're being totally rational.
It's crazy how our brains can trick us, right?
It really is. He talks about things like anchoring, where, let me see if I can explain this. It's like our initial judgment about something gets influenced by some random piece of information, even if we know it has nothing to do with the actual decision.
Anchoring is such a classic example. Like if you're asked to estimate the population of a city, your answer might be swayed by a random number you saw just a minute ago, even if you know that number is totally unrelated.
It's like our brains are grabbing onto that first piece of information and using it as a starting point, even if it makes no sense.
And Brown argues that if we understand these little quirks, it can help us design better tools and use them more effectively. We have to outsmart our own brains sometimes.
It's like be aware of your own weaknesses, right? And use the tools to help you compensate for them. We can't totally get rid of bias, but we can at least try to minimize its influence.
It's like putting up guardrails to keep us on track, even when our brains want to veer off course.
So how do we put all this together? Brown talks about a multi-method approach, right? What does that even mean?
It means using different approaches to look at the same decision. By comparing what each method tells us, we can feel more confident about our conclusions and also spot hidden assumptions we might not have realized we were making.
So it's like, get a second opinion. But in this case, maybe you're getting 3 or 4 opinions, all from different angles.
Exactly. Remember the career choice example. He shows how you can evaluate the decision using direct assessment by breaking it down into criteria and by considering how different levels of risk might affect things.
So you're basically looking at the same problem through different lenses to see if you end up in the same place.
And by comparing what each approach tells you, you get this more nuanced, more solid understanding of what to do. Like triangulating your position using multiple data points.
That makes a lot of sense. But even with all that, Brown still says it's important to be critical, don't just blindly trust the models. He has this other story about a government analysis where they ended up with a really messed up result because one input got counted twice.
It's like a reminder to always double-check your work. Make sure you haven't made any silly mistakes or missed any crucial details.
So we've talked about a lot here. Subrational decisions, decision aiding, the GEO framework, all these different tools, and even a little bit about how our brains can play tricks on us. What's sticking out to you so far? What are you finding most interesting?
It's been a lot, hasn't it? Decision-making, all these tools, the psychology of it all. What really gets me is that it's not about, finding the one perfect right answer. It's more about making a choice you feel good about. Like you did your homework.
I was just thinking that. It's not like we're trying to outsource our decisions to some algorithm or formula or whatever. It's about using these things, these tools, to help us, to make us better decision makers.
Exactly. And Brown even says this, that in the end, decision analysis, all this stuff, it should lead to a choice that feels right to you. Even if it doesn't perfectly match what the model spits out.
It's that gut feeling, right? But a gut feeling informed by actually thinking things through.
Exactly. We're not robots, are we? We have to bring our own judgment into it, and that's okay.
So, big picture, What are the main takeaways from our deep dive into Rex Brown's rational choice and judgment?
Well, first off, we got to admit that we don't always make decisions as rationally as we think we do. We all have these biases, these little inconsistencies in our thinking that can lead us down the wrong path.
We got to be honest with ourselves, right? But the good news is there are things we can do about it. There are tools and strategies to help us make better judgments.
Totally. That GO framework, goals, options, outcomes, it's so useful for breaking down any decision, big or small. It helps us clarify what we're really trying to do and make sure we're not missing any important pieces.
And then we can bring in those quantitative tools, the utility and probability distributions and all that, to help us compare options and deal with, well, the fact that we can't predict the future perfectly.
But we have to remember, models are just tools. They're not the be-all and end-all. We have to understand how they work, what their limits are, and be willing to combine what they tell us with our own intuition, our own values. It's a partnership, really, between our analytical minds and our gut feelings.
It's about finding that sweet spot, right? Using the tools to guide us, but not letting them completely take over.
Right. And it's a process, a journey. There's always something new to learn, new ways to refine how we make decisions.
Well, there you have it, folks. A deep dive into decision analysis. We hope you found it, I don't know, maybe eye-opening, thought-provoking, maybe even a little bit empowering. The point is, making good decisions, it's a skill we can all work on. It's about being more aware of how we think, taking advantage of the tools that are out there, and ultimately, trusting ourselves to make choices that are in line with our goals and values. Thanks for joining us.